She was the last of the Stuart monarchs and inherited a country divided politically. Health and friendships were always insecure. Join me now as we look at the life of Anne, Queen of Great Britain. An historic birth took place at St James's Palace on the 6th of February 1665, when Anne came into the world. She was the daughter of the Duke of York, who was the younger brother of Charles II and his first wife, Anne Hyde. Although they had 8 children in total, only Anne and her elder sister Mary would reach adulthood. Growing up, Anne had on the whole been reasonably healthy, although she did suffer from an eye complaint that was untreatable in England. She was sent to France and lived for a time with her paternal grandmother, Henrietta Maria. Yet after she passed away in 1669, Anne would stay with her aunt, Henrietta Anne, the Duchess of Orleans, but she died suddenly in 1670. Anne would now return to England, and yet more tragedy was around the corner, with her mother passing away the following year. Anne and her sister Mary would continue their childhood at Richmond. Traditionally, children were parted from their parents and supervised by the Crown. Charles II said he had wanted them to be raised as Protestants, with their education leaning towards the Anglican Church. It was sometime around 1671 that Anne first set eyes on Sarah Jennings. These two would become great friends, with Sarah becoming one of Anne's most influential advisors. Life at court now would take on a new meaning for the sisters. Their father had converted to Catholicism and married the Catholic Princess Mary of Modena, who was only 6 years older than Anne. With Charles having no legitimate children, this placed the Duke next in line for succession. But the following years were painful for the newlyweds. 10 children were either stillborn or died in infancy, leaving both Anne and Mary high up in the pecking order for the throne. In November 1677, Mary married William III of Orange. Anne couldn't attend as she was suffering from smallpox. Mary, meanwhile, would leave England for a new life in the Netherlands. Around a year later, and now fully recovered, Anne would make a trip to see her sister. In March 1679, Anne's father would leave England in haste. This was on the back of the Popish Plot, a fictitious conspiracy invented by Titus Oates that gripped the kingdoms of England and Scotland between 1678 and 1681, and put in place what can only be described as anti-Catholic hysteria. Upon their return, they settled in Scotland at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh. Anne did visit them, but it would be a final journey outside the borders of England. As Anne came of age, it was a good time for gossip concerning her future suitors. George of Hanover and Lord Mulgrave were names thrown into the hat, but nothing came of these. King Charles would now start to look. His priorities for a successful partner included that the boy must be an eligible prince and be accepted by both Protestant and Catholics alike. However, a daunting task. Louis XIV of France was keen to secure a marriage with Prince George of Denmark. This would create an Anglo-Danish alliance and help to keep in check the power of the Dutch. But William of Orange was unhappy at this proposal, but he could do little to stop it. On the 28th of July 1683, Anne married George. The couple were devoted and remained faithful, and although the families had arranged the marriage, hardly any discussions happened between the pair before the big day arrived. Home now was in the Palace of Whitehall, a group of buildings called a cockpit. Anne would now look to support from her friends. The first on the list was her closest companion, Sarah Churchill, who would take on the role of Lady of the Bedchamber. The newlyweds set out to produce some children, and it wasn't long before Anne became pregnant. Unfortunately, the child was stillborn. After the death of Charles II in 1685, Anne's father took over the reins of power. He was now King James II of England and 7th of Scotland. Due to his conversion to Catholic beliefs years earlier, James started to make significant changes at court. He gave high-ranking positions to Catholics in the military and administrative positions. These changes created much anxiety around the country as it contravened the Test Act, a series of English penal laws set as a religious test for public office, and to stop any single religious belief in having overall control over the other. It was aimed at Roman Catholics and nonconformists. Anne herself also had concerns about how these changes affected the relative peace that had existed between both religious beliefs. until this point. James continued to reinforce his Catholic ways to the detriment of everyone else, including his daughter Anne. It all came to a head when James attempted to baptise Anne's youngest daughter into the Catholic faith. Anne broke down and in a letter to her sister said,
"The Church of Rome is wicked and dangerous, their ceremonies, most of them, plain downright idolatry."
The Church of England was under threat. In Anne's eyes, this display of power must cease. She would eventually distance herself from both her father and stepmother. By 1687, darkness spread over Anne. She had miscarried and her husband had been infected with smallpox, but the same disease also took her two youngest daughters. Anne was grief-stricken along with her husband, and words could not describe the heartache that the couple found themselves in at this awful time. To make matters worse, Anne would have another stillborn child later in the year. The country was reeling now. James had built a rod for his own back, and the latest news just made things worse. It was said his wife, Mary of Modena, had become pregnant. Anne was suspicious of this revelation and called it fake news. Again, she wrote to her sister, claiming,
"They will stick at nothing, be it never so wicked, if it will promote their interest. There may be foul play intended."
By the end of 1688, Anne had travelled to Bath to recuperate after yet another miscarriage. And in the meantime, Mary did give birth. It was no con after all. James Francis Edward Stuart on the 10th of June 1688. The reality was now the succession could easily take the country back into a Catholic state. After the birth, Anne left London. She was angered by the events and once again wrote to her sister,
"I shall never now be satisfied, whether the child be true or false. It may be it is our brother, but God only knows. One cannot help having 1,000 fears and melancholy thoughts, but whatever changes may happen, you shall ever find me firm to my religion, and faithfully yours."
On the 5th of November 1688, William of Orange invaded Britain. James was deposed as king, and for Anne this was the best news she had received in years. She acknowledged William's rule and approved his actions. Anne's close friend Sarah Churchill also disowned the former king, but James, who was now almost out of sight and mind, continued to cause problems. He ordered that Sarah must be placed under house arrest, yet this never happened. Both Anne and Sarah made good their escape down some stairs and out of Whitehall to the relative safety and care of Bishop Compton. They set out for Nottingham the following day and then on to Oxford, but this time with a large entourage. Here, Anne met with Prince George, and by now they were both feeling jubilant over the fall of James. James was bemoaning his fall, and he said,
"God help me, even my children have forsaken me."
Anne returned to London after discovering that James had fled to the continent. William would visit Anne, yet she chose not to discuss her father's whereabouts, and in all honesty, did she care at that point? In January 1689, Parliament convened and declared that James had abdicated the throne of England and Scotland, and both were now up for grabs. A new start for the realm would see William and Mary now declared as the new monarchs. Changes started to take place quickly. A new Bill of Rights and Claim Act followed. A new structure on the way descendants could now move into a line of succession. For Anne, this meant she was now potentially a candidate as overall ruler. It was a glorious revolution and a landmark act in the constitutional law of England. Anne gave birth to a son on the 24th of July 1689, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester. The possibility that William and her sister Mary would have no children left the youngster in line to become king and acquire the crown. It wasn't always this harmonious between the sisters. Anne had requested the use of Richmond Palace and a little money to help pave her way to the finer things in life. But both were refused. This didn't go down well with Anne. It was thought that if Anne had too much financial power, this could cause a weakening of their power and influence. Not to mention, Anne could also start plans to overthrow the monarchy. Two childhood friends, Anne and Sarah, now Duchess of Marlborough after her marriage to John Churchill, would both face a confrontation at court. It was suspected in 1692 that John was secretly colluding with some of James' followers. The accusation would force John away from court. Yet Anne and Sarah dismissed the accusation as nonsense, and both would attend a social event in front of William and Mary. Yet Mary had dismissed the Churchills from all occasions. It left Anne angered at the treatment, and she left her royal apartments and settled into life now at Syon House, home of the Duke of Somerset. But it didn't end there. Anne was deprived, her guard of honour removed, the courtiers were not allowed to visit, and to top that, civil authorities were told to steer clear and ignore her. Anne gave birth to a son, but the boy died within minutes. Mary visited, and Anne thought to offer some comfort. How wrong she was. Mary tore into Anne and reprimanded her ongoing friendship with Sarah. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, and the sisters never saw each other again. In 1694, Mary passed away. William would continue to reign, but now alone. Anne was now next in line of succession. Even if William remarried and had children due to the acts passed some years earlier, it would be assigned a lower slot in the line of succession. William thought enough was enough and held out an olive branch to Anne, and this would once again lift her not just to a higher status, but her honours restored and allotted rooms at St James's Palace. In 1700, Anne ended her days of attempting to become a mother again. She would suffer yet another stillbirth. Anne over her life had been pregnant 17 times. It's thought 12 of these were stillborn. Of the remaining 5, 4 died before reaching the age of 2. It's unknown why she had so many problems, and much is based on theories that attempt to explain her potential illnesses over the years. One thing is for sure, Anne suffered from gout. This single disorder would heavily contribute to her lameness around the court later in life. She would either be carried or had to use a wheelchair to help her movements. It was this that would ultimately push her weight up due to lack of exercise and inactivity. Sir John Clarke, the first baronet, described her in 1706.
Under a fit of the gout and in extreme pain and agony, and on this occasion everything about her was much in the same disorder as about the meanest of her subjects. Her face, which was red and spotted, was rendered something frightful by her negligent dress, and the foot affected was tied up with a poultice and some nasty bandages. I was much affected by this sight.
Anne's only surviving child succumbed to death at the tender age of 11. He passed away on the 30th of July 1700. Anne was paralysed with grief and showed her household that they must mourn this day every year upon the anniversary of his death. It also left the succession in a bit of a mess. William was childless and Anne's son had now gone, and so Anne was next in line due to the acts passed. But then a new act was passed in 1701, the Act of Settlement. Parliament had drawn it up to settle the succession to the English and Irish crowns on Protestants only. Yet this version omitted over 50 Catholic claims that were all stronger than the ones currently in power. When Anne's father James died later that year, her stepmother wrote to Anne asking for her to restore the line of the family into the succession. But by then it was too late. Anne had agreed to the new act, and from here on in, she was undoubtedly going to become the new queen. On the 8th of March 1702, William died and Anne became queen. But joy would turn to despair upon her first speech at Parliament, where Anne slightly distanced herself from her late brother-in-law, but this could also be that her memories were long of her sister, and it was something she couldn't let go. She would go on to say,
"As I know my heart to be entirely English, I can very sincerely assure you there is not anything you can expect or desire from me which I shall not be ready to do for the happiness and prosperity of England."
Anne would appoint her husband as Lord High Admiral, along with giving Lord Marlborough the new rank of Captain General. But John also got elevated to Duke and created a Knight of the Garter. His wife Sarah became Groom of the Stool, Mistress of the Robes, and Keeper of the Privy Purse. Anne's coronation took place on the 23rd of April 1702. It was St George's Day. Due to her ongoing health problems, she was carried to Westminster Abbey in a sedan chair. Throughout Anne's reign, many events changed the shape of the world and her own territory. England became embroiled and implicated in the War of Spanish Succession, yet another complicated political divide of the day. Apart from the ongoing dramas abroad, back at home, Anne took many interests. She became a patron of the theatre. She loved poetry and music to the point she would pay Handel £200 a year to hear his latest tunes. The Royal Mint created new medals for military achievement. These have been designed and produced by, among others, Isaac Newton, who would find himself knighted in 1705 when Anne paid a visit to Cambridge. Scotland remained resolute that they wanted an independent sovereign state with a dynasty headed up by Stuarts. Anne decided this must change. She wanted a united kingdom and declared this to be of the utmost importance. A commission from England and Scotland met in 1702, but by 1703 the talks had stalled and no agreement could be made. The Scots, instead of agreeing to the English Act of Settlement, created their own. It was the Act of Security. This stated on the death of Queen Anne, without issue, the 3 estates of the Parliament were to appoint a Protestant successor from the descendants of the Scottish kings, but not the English successor unless various economic, political and religious conditions were met. Anne considered this as blackmail and withheld any clarification until examined more closely, but that didn't take long, as the Act also stated that unless she agreed, Scotland would withdraw support and supplies to English wars. So was that the end of it? Well, no is the answer. To counteract the Scottish Act, England created yet another known as the Alien Act. It would deem that any Scottish nationals in England were treated as foreign nationals. It also included an embargo on imports on Scottish products. It ended with Scotland agreeing to the English terms and the Alien Act was removed by Parliament. We would now see a new kingdom. Both English and Scottish parliaments came together for the first time on the 1st of May 1707. This historic agreement meant that now Great Britain had been formed. In Parliament throughout the years of Anne, 2 political parties were developed. One, the Tories, who were supportive of the Anglican Church and favoured the gentry within the country. The other was the Whigs. Now they were more proactive towards Protestant dissenters and commercial opportunities. It was an easy choice for Anne to make, being a lady of stature. Well, that's stature, not Thatcher. Legislation and laws would change throughout the coming years, and mainly to the acceptance of Anne. Previous loopholes were closed and the Tories pretty much signed, sealed and delivered on the majority of the laws. By now feeling a little downbeat, the Whigs suddenly discovered things were changing slightly in their favour. They had always supported the War of the Spanish Succession, and when John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, won his most significant victory at Blenheim in 1704, many members of the Tory party had been removed from Parliament, and this now caused a true political battlefield, with the Tories needing more support from the Whigs to introduce new measures. This opened a rift between Anne and Sarah. Sarah had been arguing with Anne that more Whigs should be included in Parliament and reduce the number of Tories, but Anne was now becoming displeased by Sarah's remarks. In 1706, Anne was forced into accepting Lord Sunderland as a Whig. He was also Marlborough's son-in-law. This strengthened the Ministry of Parliament but weakened Anne's position with them. Anne looked for advice to quell the situation. One person was Abigail Hill, not really a political powerhouse of the day, but Anne's woman of the bedchamber. Yet Abigail was on a crest of a wave, while Anne's friendship with Sarah was pretty much sinking without trace. Robert Harley seemed to be at the centre of most of the controversy, and he was also the Speaker of the House. You see, Robert was at a crossroads. Initially, he was a Whig, but over time defected to the Tories. This clearly didn't gain him many friends, and his enemies were always within shouting distance. On one occasion, Harley attempted to lead the business at a cabinet meeting, but some refused to turn up. Harley was now on the back foot, and although Anne liked him, she knew politically this was wrong, and eventually had to remove him from service. An astonishing action occurred later that year. James Francis Edward Stuart had attempted to take the throne of Scotland with help from a French resistance force, but Anne withheld royal assent in case the militia force became disloyal to what really was now her kingdom. The invasion never landed and was chased away by British ships. This stunning turn of events meant Anne was the last British sovereign to ever veto a parliamentary bill. As a result, the Tories would fall from grace and power. A new party was in town, and the Whigs gained control at the 1708 general election. Back at court and away from the political fighting of Parliament, Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, was not happy. She had found out that Abigail had been moved into rooms at Kensington Palace, rooms Sarah thought were her own to use whenever in town. In 1708, Sarah came to court with some poetry in her hand, not quite the sort of poetry a queen may be expected to view, as it was a little bawdy, which implied that Anne and Abigail were in fact lovers. This clearly went down like a lead balloon with Anne, but Sarah continued, writing to Anne saying she had brought her reputation into disrepute. Even today, historians are not quite sure of how this so-called friendship turned into a love affair, if indeed it ever did. Most seem certain that Abigail was no more than a very trusted servant and friend who held strong beliefs and gave much devotion to her husband. But this was not what Sarah wanted to hear. and the argument would continue, but this time to a decisive ending. At St Paul's Cathedral, Anne and Sarah were due to attend the Thanksgiving service for a victory at the Battle of Oudenarde. Anne refused to wear the jewels that Sarah had selected for the event. The war of words was on, culminating in Sarah telling the Queen to be quiet. It's like one of those moments when you see tumbleweeds slowly passing you by. Anne was horrified, and the silence was deafening. Sarah wrote to Anne in a covering note to a letter from her husband, and Anne replied,
After the commands you gave me on the Thanksgiving Day of not answering you, I should not have troubled you with these lines, but to return the Duke of Marlborough's letter safe into your hands, and for the same reason do not say anything to that, nor to yours which enclosed it.
In October 1708, Anne was again inconsolable. Her husband and longtime best friend had died. It would also coincide with Anne severing any relationship she might now have with Sarah, and she blamed her for being so intrusive at such a terrible time. Anne was under pressure again from Parliament. The Whigs were stirring up more problems. They eventually forced Anne into conceding new leaders, but on the matter of who should become the next Admiral after her husband's death, Anne took it upon herself to cement the role. But this move just stirred up the Whigs even more. It would take several appointments and resignations before Anne finally gave way and placed the Earl of Orford in control of the Admiralty as the First Lord in 1709. Sarah was like a dog with a bone, and she wouldn't let go and fought tooth and nail to get back at Anne. On the 6th of April 1710, Anne and Sarah were together for the last time. Sarah attempted to communicate with Anne and got the same answer repeatedly. Anne just kept repeating, "Whatever you have to say, you may put in writing. You said you desired no answer, and I shall give you none." Back in Parliament, the Whigs were now struggling with their administration due to the unpopular Spanish succession, which was still ongoing and proving to be very costly. The public were in a mood and one of discontent, and Anne needed none of this. The political ringleader of the unrest was called Henry Sacheverell. He'd been out and about preaching his thoughts and leading anti-Whig sermons. When riots broke out in London, Anne had only a guard to quell the disturbance and protect herself. Luckily, they did both. As for Sacheverell, he faced a trial, but his sentence for preaching was a slap on the wrist and pretty much rendered the whole affair pointless. The Whigs were gone, the top brass was removed, including Marlborough. Harley came back and was placed as head of this new ministry, which would first seek peace with the French, then attempt some compromise with Spain, before finally, with a general election approaching, it would reignite public confidence into returning the Tories to power, which they did with a majority. January 1711 was the start of a pretty momentous year. Sarah was back, but not for long. Anne had forced her to resign all offices, as Abigail would now be the new keeper of the Privy Purse. Although the Tories led the way in the House of Commons, things were a little different in the House of Lords. Anne was forced to create new lords to erase an anti-peace majority based upon a conformity bill raised by the Earl of Nottingham. I'm not saying the need for new peers was desperate, but even Abigail's husband found himself wearing the gowns of a baron. Ultimately, order and parity were restored. Marlborough was dismissed as a commander of the army, and finally a peace treaty was endorsed to end military involvement in the War of the Spanish Succession. It ended, and everybody could take a step back and breathe again. A couple of years later, Anne found it increasingly difficult to walk, and by Christmas she was suffering from a fever. Although she recovered after many doubted she would again become gravely ill by March. Maybe this wasn't the right time, but Anne now seemed to disapprove of what Harley was doing, and she told the cabinet
that he neglected all business, that he was seldom to be understood, that when he did explain himself, she could not depend upon the truth of what he said, that he never came to her at the time she appointed, that he often came drunk, and last, to crown all, he behaved himself towards her with ill manner, indecency and disrespect.
Parliament dismissed Harley in July 1714. Anne continued to be proactive even though her health was failing. Stress and anxiety were blamed for much of her illness she had encountered over the last few years. Whatever it was, Anne did suffer a further setback on the 30th of July 1714 when she suffered a stroke. At around 7:30 on the 1st of August, Anne, Queen of Great Britain, died. The words of her doctor sum up the event. "I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveller than death was to her. Anne was buried alongside her husband and children within the Henry VII Chapel in Westminster Abbey.